For hundreds of years, the Inupiats lived alone at the ends of the earth and maintained their tradition of whaling until they were discovered. Sometime after discovering these people, Adam Carlson was sent to the town of Barrow, Alaska, to record a story for the newspaper where he works. After finishing the job, Adam accepts a request from Nathan, a young member of the Inupiat tribe, and takes his camera to document Arnold riding a snowmobile. During the recording, the journalist notices a movement in the lake a few meters away and decides to go there to investigate. With the help of some locals, Adam finds a whale calf trapped in the snow, as the ice is blocking the channel that leads to the open sea. Like all mammals, gray whales can't breathe underwater, so they need access to fresh air to avoid drowning. However, that hole will close in a few days and, if they remain trapped there, the calf and its family will end up losing their lives. In an attempt to help the animals, Adam decides to record a story about the frozen lake, and the news ends up reaching Rachel Kramer, an animal activist. Immediately after seeing the report, the woman calls her ex-boyfriend and is furious that he hasn't contacted her to inform her of the whale's situation. In his defense, Adam recalls that when the couple broke up, Rachel asked him never to contact her again, since he was the one who decided to end the relationship. But even so, the woman says she will help him save those whales. The problem is that, as well as the ice getting thicker and the hole getting smaller, the Inupiats are planning to eliminate these animals. In an attempt to prevent this from happening, Rachel goes to a governor and asks for his help in sending the National Guard to the town of Barrow with a ship that can break the ice. When he hears this, Governor Haskell is outraged and says that he would never mobilize so many resources to save 3 whales. That afternoon, while working at Greenpeace headquarters, Rachel receives a call from Ruth McGraw, who claims to know a way to save the whales. According to her, there is a piece of equipment in California Bay that was built specifically to break ice, so Rachel will be able to use it to open the way for the whales to the open sea. All the activist has to do is ask for a National Guard helicopter to tow her to Barrow. The truth is that Ruth is the wife of J.W. McGraw, the owner of a large oil company, and she manages to convince him to lend his equipment to save the whales, so that his company will gain more popularity and public support. Now that she has borrowed a hovercraft to do the job, Rachel makes a public statement to ask for the governor's help, as she needs at least 1 National Guard helicopter to take the equipment to Barrow. Seeing the interview given by the woman, Governor Haskell realizes that his popularity is in jeopardy. So he decides to backtrack and make some members of the National Guard available to help the whales. After mobilizing all the necessary resources to start the process of rescuing those animals, Rachel travels to Alaska and meets her ex-boyfriend at Barrow Airport. When she sees Adam, she rushes to hug him, because even after so long away, she is still in love with him. However, at this point, the journalist is interested in a colleague who works for another American broadcaster and can't take his eyes off Jill, who has gone there to document the story of the whales. That morning, Colonel Scott is entrusted with the mission of taking the hovercraft to Barrow and explains to the journalists how the logistics will work to ensure that the 40-ton vehicle reaches Barrow as quickly as possible. Before the press takes over the whole city, Adam decides to go and talk to Malik to warn him about the possible attacks the Inupiats could suffer. As a people who live in isolation from the rest of society, they have to hunt their own food to survive, and, that year, the whale hunt didn't go as well as expected. So Malik wants to eliminate the 3 whales that are trapped in the ice, and this is causing people to revolt. The next day, some members of the Inupiat tribe appear before a press conference to explain that whale hunting is traditional for their people and that they need it for food. However, Rachel counters this statement by saying that the tribe can buy food with the money they receive from the oil companies that buy the right to drill on their land. At this point, Malik arrives on the scene and meets up with his friends to try to convince them to give up hunting those whales, because if the media filmed the Inupiats eliminating these animals, it could lead to a revolt and they would risk losing their right to hunt. So the group changes its mind about eliminating those whales and announces that it will help free them. In an attempt to buy more time for the animals, Malik takes a chainsaw and starts cutting the ice that is growing around the hole. Thanks to the repercussions of this case in the media, the town of Barrow is receiving more and more tourists interested in rescuing whales, which has been favorable for local businesses. As Adam enters one of his favorite restaurants in the city, he spots Jill and takes the opportunity to strike up a conversation with her. When she sees her ex-boyfriend talking to the journalist, Rachel feels jealous and gets upset when she realizes that Adam wants to help Jill get an exclusive scoop for her newspaper story. Before long, the lake's surroundings are full of reporters who have come to film the whales, who apparently don't mind the presence of all those people. As she nears the edge of the lake, Rachel is greeted by the arrival of the calf, who approaches her. At this point, the woman realizes that he is injured, so she puts on her wetsuit and decides to go down with an oxygen cylinder to find out what's wrong with the calf. When he realizes that Rachel is willing to risk her life for those animals, Adam tries to stop her from entering the water, but his ex-girlfriend ignores him and goes to meet the gray whales. While observing these animals, Rachel realizes that the calf is unable to swim to the surface on its own and has to rely on the help of its parents to breathe due to a fishing net that is caught in its tail. Fearful of being attacked at any moment, the woman approaches cautiously and begins to cut the net to free the baby. In doing so, the animal is able to swim freely again and Rachel returns to the surface relieved, with a sense of accomplishment. That afternoon, McGraw arrives in Barrow to pay a visit to the whales in order to make headlines as a friend of the environment. Every hour, the temperature of the lake drops and people begin to mobilize to help the whales break through the ice on the surface, because if the hole closes, they won't be able to breathe. On observing the calf, affectionately nicknamed Bam Bam, Malik notices that he is acting atypically and begins to suspect that he may have pneumonia. Meanwhile, Colonel Scott and his men are in the helicopter dragging the hovercraft to Barrow. However, due to the thick layers of ice under the ocean, the journey is made even more difficult. That night, after dinner with Adam and Nathan, Rachel decides to go back out onto the ice, as she is worried about what might happen to the whales during the night. Seeing the Greenpeace representative leaving the restaurant, Carl and his partner, Dean, reveal that they have gone to Alaska to help in the mission to rescue the family of whales. The pair own a family business that builds de-icers and left Minnesota to take a de-icer to break up the ice on the lake. However, as she doesn't know those guys, Rachel refuses their help and walks down to the lake to help the volunteers break the ice. Meanwhile, Jill is struggling not to be replaced by her coworker. A few days ago, she had to convince her boss to send her to Barrow, because no one was putting any faith in the repercussions of the whale case. However, now that people all over the world are following this rescue, Wes has decided to take over the story and says that Jill's tickets have already been bought so that she can return to the United States. Before returning to the lake, Rachel calls her coworker and asks if Pat needs her to bring anything from the city. At this point, the woman discovers that the temperature of the lake has plummeted and the team is unable to keep the hole open. After receiving this news, Rachel decides to give in and goes after the pair who went to Alaska to take a defroster. Knowing that this is her last hope to save the whales, she decides to take Carl and Dean by helicopter to the lake, but they can't start the machine because the buttons are frozen. Immediately, Rachel calls Adam and asks for help. The woman informs him that they need a generator and Jill, who was whining a few minutes ago about being replaced, realizes that this could be her chance to get a big break. After stealing a power generator, the pair get into the helicopter and the pilot informs them that they will need to travel with the doors open if they want to transport a running power generator. Knowing that the equipment will not work if it is switched off, the team flies with the doors open even though they are running the risk of everyone being wiped out by the cold, as the temperature is 60 degrees below zero. A few minutes later, when the group finally makes it to the lake, Jill enlists Adam's help to hold the camera and start recording while Rachel and the other volunteers continue the plan. As soon as the generator arrives on the scene, Carl and Dean mobilize to try to start the de-icing machine once again and, after a few attempts, they finally manage to get it to work. With the help of the defroster, the frozen lake has been transformed into a bubbling pool and, when he sees his coworker covering that story in the middle of the night, Wes feels disrespected because he realizes that she won't give up that job so easily. As she was the only journalist to record that epic moment, Jill receives congratulations from her producer for her intense dedication to her work and Eddie asks to speak to Adam, as he intends to ask him to send all the videos he has recorded since arriving in Alaska. It's been 3 days since Colonel Scott and his men began mobilizing to transport the hovercraft to Barrow, but halfway there, the team hit a snag. While it was being transported, the machine got stuck in a hole in the ice that is bigger than the vehicle itself, causing the 2 helicopters that were being used to pull it almost to collide in midair. Despite knowing that it won't be possible to get the hovercraft to Barrow, Scott makes a public statement that the National Guard will not stop until the whales are safe. Now that plan A has been completely discarded, Malik and the Inupiats begin to think of a new rescue plan and team up to cut holes in the ice 20 meters apart so that the whales can follow them into the open sea. Their plan consists of opening up a path of holes so that these animals can breathe along the 8 kilometers that these whales will have to swim to reach the ocean. For many, this audacious strategy sounded like complete madness, but thanks to the goodwill they showed in helping those animals, the Inupiats gained countless admirers. Moved by all the repercussions generated by those whales, the Soviet government made its icebreaker available, which is just a few kilometers away from Barrow. The media believes that this is the perfect opportunity for these 2 great powers to get closer and join forces, putting aside their rivalry. However, There is still resistance from the American government to accepting the Russians' help, so Rachel and Adam meet with some of the president's representatives to decide what to do from now on. Even knowing that the Soviets are among the biggest whale hunters in the world, Rachel knows that the best way to save those whales is to swallow their pride and allow the Russians to be recognized as heroes of the environment by clearing the way for those animals. However, Colonel Scott is firmly against this idea, as he cannot accept his enemies entering American territory to save their homeland. Upon hearing this, Rachel decides to use her final card and says that when those whales lose their lives, right in front of the cameras, there will be a great national commotion and everyone will be deeply saddened by the outcome of that story. When that happens, American citizens will ask for an explanation from the Greenpeace volunteer who was in charge of the case from the start. Then, when she gives her testimony, Rachel will make it clear that it was the government that barred the Russians from entering and prevented them from helping those animals. If this happens, the American people will revolt and the current president will certainly not be re-elected and will be remembered throughout history as the one who caused the destruction of the Alaskan whale family. Thanks to this argument, Rachel manages to change the minds of all the representatives of the American government and, that same day, the members of the Soviet Navy are contacted to head towards Barrow. Despite being an extremely robust ship, when it reaches a certain part of the ocean, the icebreaker can no longer advance, as the shallow waters would cause the vessel to run aground. Therefore, the Inupiats are tasked with taking the whales to a place near the sea and they rely on the help of volunteers to dig a path through the snow in record time in the hope that these mammals will follow them. Now that his hovercraft will no longer be the protagonist of that mission, McGraw tries at all costs to make himself the target of the spotlight with his inspiring speeches so that the audience doesn't forget that he took an active part in that rescue. Seeing all those people mobilizing to save Bam Bam and his family, Rachel gets emotional and tries to stay positive, because everything indicates that the calf won't survive until he reaches the ocean. As the little one is injured, his parents stay behind with him and don't follow the holes made in the snow. However, just as the volunteers were beginning to lose hope, the adult whales began to mobilize and swam off following the tracks they had left. The problem is that Bam Bam can't keep up with his parents and this has Rachel and her team worried. At this point, everyone is convinced that the adult whales left their calf behind, but Malik says that Bam Bam most likely lost his life. The other two whales spent the whole time trying to protect him, but now that the calf is gone they have decided to go their separate ways. When she receives this news, Rachel feels heartbroken, as she has formed a strong emotional bond with the animal. When he sees his ex-girlfriend kneeling by the lake, Adam abandons his job as a cameraman and runs to embrace her. While the journalist tries to console Rachel, Malik and the Inupiats hold Bam Bam's funeral and pay their respects to the calf. The next day, the sad news about the loss of the little whale is announced all over the news and people are moved when they find out that Bam Bam's parents stayed by his side until the very last moment. That night, McGraw approaches Rachel and congratulates her on all her efforts to save those animals. According to him, if it hadn't been for the woman's work, the whole family would have lost their lives. Finally, the man promises that he will save the other two whales whatever the cost and manages to reassure Rachel. Inspired to help make that rescue possible, all the residents of Barrow leave their jobs to cut holes in the ice. Together, the volunteers manage to open around 30 holes an hour and spot the Soviet ship approaching from afar. If work continues at the same pace, the whales will be free in the ocean by the end of the day. The only problem is that there is a wall formed by the snow that is obstructing the passage of the mammals and not even the icebreaker is being able to destroy it. When he realizes that he'll have to use even more power to break the ice, the admiral uses his ship's loudspeaker to ask everyone to move away from the barrier and turns around to try a new attack. However, once again, the Russian Navy was unable to break through the wall and the noise of the collision drove away the whales, who were frightened by the attack. Desperate, Rachel and Pat try to get his attention to bring them back and they become desperate, as they know that those animals have nowhere to go, as the holes that were opened hours ago have already frozen over again. While the whales try to get to the surface to breathe and crash into the snow, the Soviets test a new collision and this time manage to destroy the ice barrier. At that moment, everyone gathers around the rubble in the hope of seeing the whales arriving in the open sea. However, to everyone's frustration, these animals do not surface and Rachel begins to believe that they have drowned. Just when everyone thought there was no hope, the whale couple emerges and, after replenishing their oxygen supply, they continue on their way through the ocean while everyone celebrates this great victory. After the rescue, all the volunteers who were not from Barrow left the town and went back to their normal lives. Mr. McGraw took advantage of his reputation as a friend of nature to win one of the largest contracts in Alaskan history to clean up all the oil spilled by an oil company. As for Carl and Dean, they became big celebrities in Minnesota and their business boomed, making them the largest defroster company in the region. A few months later, Colonel Scott married the president's secretary and the couple went to Mexico to spend their honeymoon whale watching. After working for 3 TV stations, Jill finally achieved her dream of being hired by a national news network and consolidated her career as an investigative reporter. Thanks to the whale family's beautiful story, which has been documented in the news in several countries, the number of Greenpeace volunteers has grown rapidly and, in just a few months, the organization has quadrupled its membership. After spending several months in Alaska, Scott decided to leave the company where he worked and return to the United States to be close to Rachel, as he realized that he no longer wanted to live his life away from her. When the outsiders left, Nathan and his grandfather joined the other Inupiats to break up the mess the outsiders had made in the city. Now that all the American people know about them and their customs, they feel even more encouraged to perpetuate their traditions and inspire others with their way of life.
Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.